A bully mocked Clint Eastwood's son. His response shocked everyone. A school bully pointed at a quiet boy in the lunch line and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Your dad plays cowboys. That's all he does. He's not even a real actor." The entire cafeteria went silent. Every kid turned to look. The boy stood there holding his lunch tray, his face turning red, not sure whether to run or disappear through the floor. What happened next, and what Clint Eastwood did when he found out, left an entire school, and eventually all of Hollywood, completely speechless. It was the fall of 1976 in Carmel, California. Scott Eastwood was 9 years old. He was a quiet kid, thin, with sandy hair and serious eyes that always looked like they were working something out. He wasn't loud. He didn't brag. When most of the kids at his school had no idea who his father was for the first few weeks of third grade, Scott had kept it that way on purpose. His mother, Jocelyn Reeves, had raised him to be normal. Not Hollywood normal, actually normal. He packed his own lunch. He did his own homework. He didn't ride to school in fancy cars or show up with designer clothes. He wore sneakers with a small hole near the left toe. He ate peanut butter sandwiches on plain white bread. He was just a kid trying to fit in, the same as every other kid in that school. But secrets in small towns don't stay secrets for long. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. The cafeteria smelled like warm macaroni and industrial cleaning soap. Scott was standing in line holding a brown plastic tray, waiting his turn, thinking about nothing in particular. The boy behind him, a large, loud fifth grader named Derek Holt, had found out over the weekend exactly who Scott's father was. Derek was the kind of kid who turned every piece of information into a weapon. He leaned forward and said it clearly, not caring who heard. "Hey, everybody, you know who his dad is? Clint Eastwood, the cowboy guy, the one who squints in those dumb old movies and pretends to shoot people." He put on an exaggerated face, narrowed his eyes, mimicked drawing a fake gun. The kids around him laughed. "Cowboys and horses," Derek said louder now, really warming up. "That's all he does. He's not a real actor. He's just a guy who wears a hat and grunts. My dad says he can't even act. He just stands there." The cafeteria had gone quiet the way cafeterias only go quiet when something real is happening. Scott didn't move. He just stood there holding his tray. He didn't cry. He didn't yell back. He didn't tell a teacher. He walked to his usual table alone, set down his tray, and ate his peanut butter sandwich without saying a word to anyone. But his hands were shaking the whole time. That night, Jocelyn noticed. She always noticed things about Scott. She could tell the difference between tired quiet and hurt quiet. This was hurt quiet. She sat beside him at the kitchen table after dinner while he was pretending to do homework. "What happened today?" she asked. He told her, every word, including the fake squinting and the fake gun, and all the kids laughing. Jocelyn listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I'm going to tell your father." Scott looked up from his notebook. He was scared and embarrassed, and secretly, somewhere deep in his chest, a little bit hopeful. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Jocelyn said quietly, "but I'm going to." Now here is the thing most people don't know about Clint Eastwood in 1976. He was not just famous. He was the biggest movie star in the world. Dirty Harry had come out 5 years earlier. The outlaw Josie Wales had just finished filming. He had started Malpaso Productions, his own company, and was running it with precision and control that most studio heads envied. He was on every magazine cover. He was in every conversation. He was 46 years old at the absolute peak of his power, and people in Hollywood genuinely feared disappointing him. And he was about to drive 40 minutes to visit his 9-year-old son because a kid named Derek had laughed at him in a cafeteria. He arrived on a Saturday morning. He drove himself, no driver, no assistant, an old dark blue truck that looked like something a rancher might drive. He parked on the street. He walked to the door and knocked. Scott answered it before Jocelyn could even get up from her chair. For a moment, father and son just looked at each other. Scott had been rehearsing things to say all week, casual things, things that would show his dad he wasn't bothered, things that would make the whole story sound smaller than it felt. He said none of them. Clint put his hand on Scott's shoulder. That was all, just his big hand on the boy's thin shoulder. And somehow that was enough. And they drove together without much talking. Clint had a place outside town, a small piece of land with a few horses and an old wooden fence that always needed something fixed. He'd been coming here for years when he needed to think. He'd never brought Scott before. He parked the truck near the fence and they got out and leaned against it, side by side, looking at the horses grazing in the morning light. Scott waited for the speech, the big famous actor speech, the "don't let bullies get to you" speech, the "you should be proud of your father" speech. It didn't come. Instead, Clint said, "I heard what that kid said about me." Scott looked at his sneakers. "It's okay. It doesn't matter." "It mattered enough that you couldn't eat your dinner for 3 nights, Clint said. Scott had no answer for that. Clint was quiet for a while. One of the horses walked closer to the fence and Clint reached out and touched its nose without looking away from the field. "You know what the hardest part of my job is?" Clint asked. Scott shook his head. "Letting people be wrong about you," Clint said. "Not correcting them, not defending yourself, not proving anything. Just letting them be wrong and moving forward anyway." Scott thought about that. "But he said you can't act." "I know. He was wrong. I know that too," Clint said. "But whether he knows it doesn't change what I do or who I am. The only thing I can control is the work. Everything else is just noise." Scott kicked at the dirt with his toe. It still felt bad. "Of course it did," Clint said. He turned and looked directly at his son. "Feeling bad when someone mocks you doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." They stayed at that fence for 2 hours, mostly quiet. Clint taught Scott how to properly brush a horse that afternoon. He showed him how to hold the brush, where to move it, how to tell from the animal's breathing whether you were going too hard or not hard enough. "You pay attention to what the other person needs," Clint said, moving the brush in long, steady strokes. "Not what you want to give them, what they actually need." Scott was quiet. Then he said, "Is that acting too?" Clint laughed. A real laugh, not the polite kind. "Yeah, I suppose it is." On the drive back, Scott finally asked the question that had been sitting in his throat all day. "Are you going to talk to Derek's parents or something?" Clint kept his eyes on the road. "Hey, what would you want me to do?" "I don't know," Scott said honestly. "Well, here's what I'm going to do," Clint said. "Nothing." Scott looked up. "Nothing?" "Nothing dramatic. Nothing that makes you the kid whose famous dad came in and fixed things. That's not help. That's embarrassment in a different costume." He paused. "But I am going to come to your school." Scott's eyes went wide. "What?" "Your teacher called your mother last week, before any of this. She asked if I'd be willing to speak to the class as part of a section they're doing on storytelling and film." He glanced over at Scott. "I said no at the time. I'm going to say yes now." Scott stared at him. "You're going to come to my class?" "Next Friday, if your teacher still wants me." "Why?" Clint was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you should be able to hold your head up in that cafeteria, and because that boy deserves a chance to be wrong about me directly rather than just from a distance." Scott didn't sleep much that week. He was happy and terrified and proud and embarrassed all at once, which is a combination only 9-year-olds can truly experience at full intensity. He told exactly no one that his father was coming. Not his best friend, not the kind girl who always saved him a seat near the window. Nobody. He didn't want anyone to think he'd told on Derek. He didn't want anyone to think this was some kind of revenge. He wanted to see what happened when nobody was ready. Friday came gray and cold. A coastal California October morning with the smell of eucalyptus in the air and fog still sitting low over the hills. Clint arrived at 9 a.m. When he drove the same old truck, he wore jeans and a dark jacket, no sunglasses, no entourage. He checked in at the front office like every other parent who visited. The school secretary looked up from her desk, looked back down at her paperwork, then slowly looked up again. Her mouth opened and stayed open. "Good morning," Clint said. "I'm here to speak to Mrs. Garland's class." The words spread through the teacher's lounge in about 4 minutes. By the time Clint walked down the hallway toward room 12, every teacher whose classroom faced the hall had found a reason to stand near their window. But the third graders didn't know yet. Mrs. Garland had told them only that a special guest was coming, a person who worked in the film industry. She hadn't said more than that. When the door opened and Clint Eastwood walked in, the room made a sound. Not one specific sound, a collection of sounds. Gasps and whispers in one desk chair, scraping back too fast and falling over. Scott sat perfectly still at his desk near the middle of the room. He kept his eyes straight ahead. His hands were flat on the desk surface. His face revealed nothing. He had been practicing this expression all week. Clint stood at the front of the room and looked at 22 wide-eyed third graders. "Good morning," he said. That voice, even the children knew that voice. Mrs. Garland introduced him properly, and 17 hands shot up before she even finished her sentence. Clint smiled and pointed at the first hand. "Are you really Dirty Harry?" "I played him," Clint said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Dirty Harry exists in a story. I exist here, talking to you. Stories are powerful things, but the person telling them is just a person." He spoke for 40 minutes. Not about movies, not about fame, not about guns or horses or cowboy hats. He talked about storytelling, about how every story needs a character who wants something and has to fight to get it, about how the fight is the interesting part, not the winning, about how the best stories are the ones that feel true even when they're made up. "Has anyone here ever told a story?" he asked. Every hand went up. "Good. You're all storytellers then." He asked them questions, real questions, not pretend interest questions. He asked a girl named Maria what her favorite story was and actually listened to her answer about a book involving a dog that learned to talk. He asked a boy named Timothy whether stories were better in books or movies and had a real conversation about the answer. He called on kids whose hands weren't up. He remembered every name after hearing it once. The room was completely his. And then, about halfway through, something happened that nobody in that room would ever forget. Derek Holt was sitting in the fourth row. He'd been sliding lower and lower in his chair since Clint walked in. His face had gone from shocked to uncomfortable to something close to ashamed. He hadn't raised his hand once. Clint looked at him, not pointed at him, not called him out, just looked at him with those steady eyes the way the man with no name used to look at someone across a dusty street. "What's your name?" Clint asked quietly. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear. Derek, Clint repeated. "I hear you've got opinions about acting." The room went completely still. Every single child stopped breathing. Derek's face had turned the color of a stop sign. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "That's okay," Clint said, his voice easy, not cruel. "Everyone's a critic. You know what I tell critics?" Derek shook his head. "I tell them they're right," Clint said, "until the work proves otherwise." He paused. "And then the work speaks. Not me. The work." He wasn't angry. He wasn't cold. He wasn't humiliating the boy. He was doing something harder and rarer than any of those things. He was teaching him something. "You see, Derek, it's easy to have an opinion about what someone else can or can't do. It's much harder to do the thing yourself." Clint leaned against Mrs. Garland's desk. "I've had a lot of people tell me I couldn't do things. Directors, studio executives, critics who got paid to say I was no good. You know what I did with their opinions?" Derek shook his head again. "I used them," Clint said. "Every single one. I kept every bad review and every dismissal and every time someone laughed, and I made them into fuel. Not anger. Fuel." He looked around the room. "That's a secret about life. Other people's doubt about you is some of the most powerful energy in the world if you aim it in the right direction." Then Clint turned away from Derek and moved on, smooth and natural, like that moment had simply been part of the lesson. Derek sat there staring at his desk. He was not destroyed. He was not humiliated. He was not made to apologize in front of everyone, which would have made him hate Scott forever. He was simply shown, by the exact man he'd mocked, that he was wrong. Shown it quietly, shown it with grace. The class ended. Mrs. Garland's students gave Clint a standing ovation. Third graders, clapping on their feet. As everyone packed up their things, Clint walked slowly toward the door. He stopped beside Scott's desk. He didn't make a big moment out of it. He just put his hand on Scott's shoulder again, the same way he had that Saturday morning at the fence. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Scott said. That was all. But every child in that room saw it, and every child in that room understood exactly what it meant. Scott Eastwood walked into the cafeteria that day with his head completely up. Derek was already sitting at his usual table. When Scott walked past, In short, Derek looked at his tray and didn't say a single word. Not then, not the next day, not the week after. But 3 weeks later, something changed. Scott was working on a drawing project in art class. He was struggling. He was trying to draw a horse and it kept coming out looking like a lumpy dog. He erased it 4 times and started over 4 times, and each version was somehow worse than the last. Derek was sitting 2 tables over. He watched for a while without saying anything. Then he slid his own paper over. He'd drawn a horse, a good one. Clean lines, accurate proportions, easy confidence in every stroke. "Start with the legs," Derek said. Not sorry, not friendly exactly, just direct and helpful. "If you get the legs right, the rest comes easier." Scott looked at the drawing, then at Derek, then back at the drawing. "Okay," Scott said. Derek nodded and moved his paper back. They weren't friends after that, not right away, but they weren't enemies either. And in the ecosystem of a 3rd-grade classroom, that was something. That was actually quite a lot. The story might have ended there. A father showing up, handling it with grace, a bully learning a lesson, 2 boys finding an uneasy peace. But that's not quite the end, because 12 years later, in 1988, Scott Eastwood was 21 years old and trying to figure out his own path. He'd been told his whole life that having a famous father was an advantage. Open doors, easy opportunities, a name that meant something before you even opened your mouth. But Scott had learned something growing up that most people with famous parents don't learn until much later. A door your father opened is not the same as a door you walk through yourself. He'd spent his late teens trying different things. Construction work for a summer, a brief attempt at college, work on his father's film sets, but always behind the camera, never in front of it, because he was trying to figure out who he was outside of the shadow first. In 1988, he told his father he wanted to act. He expected Clint to be enthusiastic. He expected encouragement. He expected the network to open up, the calls to be made, the path to be cleared. What he got was something entirely different. "Okay," Clint said. "Go audition." Scott blinked. "That's it? That's it? You're not going to help?" Clint looked at his son. He was 60 years old now. His face had that quality it always had, measuring, patient, seeing further down the road than the person in front of him. "I taught you about horses when you were 9. Did I ride yours for you?" Scott opened his mouth, closed it. "This is the same thing," Clint said. "I can teach you what I know. I can give you every piece of advice I have. But the audition room is yours to walk into and yours to walk out of. If I make calls and pull strings, you'll always wonder. Wonder what? Whether you're there because you earned it," Clint said, "and so will everyone else." Scott was frustrated. He was 21 and impatient in the way 21-year-olds are impatient, when every year feels like a year being stolen. He wanted help. He wanted the easy path. He wanted his father to use some of the enormous power he carried so effortlessly. But he also remembered a Saturday morning at a fence, a hand on his shoulder, a voice saying, "The only thing I can control is the work." He went and auditioned. He got rejected a lot. That first year, he got rejected more times than he could count. Small parts that went to other people. Callbacks that turned into nothing. Rooms full of people who looked at him and saw his father's cheekbones and his father's height and expected the whole package and were somehow disappointed when they got something different. He called Clint after a particularly brutal rejection, a film he'd been sure he was going to get, a supporting role in an action movie. He'd done 3 callbacks. He'd been almost certain. "They said I wasn't quite ready," Scott told him. "They said I had presence but not control. Said that I was performing instead of being." There was a long pause on the phone. "They weren't wrong," Clint said. Another pause, longer this time. "The difference between performing and being," Clint continued, "is the difference between showing the audience your effort and letting them forget you're working at all. When I was starting out, a director told me I was wooden. He was right. I was so busy trying to look like an actor that I forgot to just be a man in a situation." "How did you fix it?" "I stopped trying to act," Clint said. "I started trying to listen, in every scene, to the other person, to the space, to what the moment actually needs, not what I'd planned to give it." Scott sat with that. He kept auditioning. He kept getting rejected. He kept calling his father. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, he started getting different feedback. Not ready became interesting but rough. Rough became compelling but unpolished. Unpolished became we want to see him again. In 1990, Scott Eastwood got his first real film role, a small supporting part, 3 scenes, 12 lines. Nothing that would make any headlines anywhere. He called his father. "I got one," Scott said. He could hear Clint smiling through the phone. "Was it yours to get?" Clint asked. Scott thought about the audition room, the way he'd listened instead of performed, the way he'd stopped thinking about his father's career and started being present in his own. The way the casting director had looked at him at the end and said simply, "Yes, yes," Scott said. "It was mine." "Then go make something out of it." He did. And Scott Eastwood's career developed slowly and honestly, the way his father had intended. Not in a straight line, not without struggle. There were years of small parts and years of better parts, and years where the industry tried to put him in a box marked famous son, and he refused to stay in it. He became his own thing, a different kind of actor from his father. Different instincts, different energy, different choices. He found his range through trial and error and more rejection than any casual observer of his career ever knew about. And in every interview for the rest of his career, when someone asked Scott Eastwood, who taught him the most about acting, about resilience, about dealing with doubt and criticism and failure, he said the same thing every time. He said his father taught him none of those things in a studio or on a set. And he said his father taught him on a Saturday morning at a wooden fence in Carmel, California, when he was 9 years old and his hands were still shaking from the embarrassment of a lunch line and a loud kid and a room full of people laughing at someone he loved. He said his father didn't give a speech, didn't make calls, didn't fix it with money or fame or pressure. He just showed up, put a hand on his son's shoulder, and said, "The only thing I can control is the work." That lesson took 20 years to fully understand, Scott always said, but once it landed, it never left. In 2005, Scott was 38 years old and already a solid working actor, with a real career he'd built with his own hands. He was doing press for a film he'd made, a smaller independent movie that was getting good notices at festivals. And an interviewer asked him the same question interviewers always asked. "What's it like having Clint Eastwood as your father?" Scott smiled. He'd answered this 100 times. He knew all the safe, gracious answers. Instead, he told the story of the lunch line. The fake squinting, Derek and his contempt and all the kids laughing. He told the story of the Saturday morning and the horses and his father's hand on his shoulder. He told the story of showing up to school on Friday and watching his father walk into that room and handle everything, not with anger or revenge or Hollywood power, but with quiet presence and something that looked a lot like grace. The interviewer was visibly moved. "Your father never made that boy apologize?" she asked. "No," Scott said. "He did something better. He made him think." "Is that harder?" Scott smiled again. Wider this time, with something in his eyes that belonged entirely to his father's face. Immeasurably. There are things about fame that eat people alive. The ego of it. The assumption that power should be used whenever it can be. The idea that when someone wrongs you or the people you love, the right response is to crush them with everything you have. Clint Eastwood had more than enough power in 1976 to destroy a 9-year-old bully's family socially, professionally, in every way that mattered in a small California town. He could have called the school board. He could have shown up with lawyers. He could have made a single phone call that would have ensured that family knew exactly what it meant to laugh at Clint Eastwood's son. He didn't do any of those things. He showed up in an old truck. He leaned against a fence. He taught his son how to brush a horse. He walked into a classroom and showed a boy named Derek, not that he was wrong to doubt him, but that doubt is only fuel if you know how to burn it. And he let his son fail and fall and get back up on his own terms and find his own feet and walk through his own doors. Because a door your father opened is not the same as a door you walked through yourself. That's the part of Clint Eastwood's story that doesn't make the magazines. The gun, the squint, the poncho, the $270 million box office. Those are the stories people know. The real story is a quiet Saturday morning in 1976 with a 9-year-old boy whose hands were still shaking and a father who drove 40 minutes to stand at a fence and say nothing particularly dramatic and everything that mattered. True strength doesn't announce itself. It shows up in an old truck, it drives to the school, it walks in through the front office like every other parent. It puts a hand on a small shoulder. It says the only thing I can control is the work. And then it gets out of the way and lets the person it loves figure out the rest. Scott Eastwood has said publicly that his father is his greatest hero, not because of the movies, not because of the career, not because of the Academy Awards or the box office records or the 6-decade run at the top of Hollywood. Should he because of a wooden fence and a horse and a Saturday morning when his father showed him that the most powerful thing a person can do in the face of cruelty is simply refuse to become it. That lesson is worth more than any film ever made. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that real strength is quiet. Real love doesn't need an audience, and the best thing any parent can ever do for their child is not remove every obstacle in their path, but walk beside them long enough to show them how to walk it themselves. Have you had someone in your life who taught you something important without making a speech about it? Share your story in the comments. Subscribe and ring the notification bell for more stories about the quiet moments that change everything.